to compete in a district here, election in a district here, the possibility that you're really thinking about relations between India and the U.S. I mean, some of that rhetoric may be important. So when you're speaking to the Indians here, then you might talk about such relationships. But on the whole, it's not going to be an important consideration. That's a much more important consideration at the national level. It can be a consideration at state level because California in particular is a huge economy in itself. I mean, if you ranked world economies, California, leave out corporations, would be among the 10 largest world economies by itself, right? So obviously trade between California and India, right, would be an important consideration, right? And that's where the kind of question that you're asking would be germane, because then you would say that, well, there might be some sensitivity to what is happening. But this is, again, only going to be the case where an Indian American standing for office is addressing an Indian American constituency. But that's not going to be your only constituency. If you're standing for election in a district, there are going to be lots of voters who are obviously not Indian Americans, right? Yeah. So I think that you would have to keep that consideration in mind. I mean, in California, all kinds of other considerations might become important because, for example, if you have growing collaboration between Hollywood and Bollywood, which I think is on the decks, and it was evident that things would start going in that direction even before Slumdog, started raising that prospect in people's minds. So a couple of years before that, there were intensive discussions going on about Indian films, some of them being made in part here, some Hollywood films being made in part in India, joint productions, right? Those kinds of things, crossover of stars. Now, when that sort of thing happens, again, it is a matter of state politics too, because what kind of legislation would be conducive to such promotion of collaboration would be an important consideration.
And with regards to what you were just saying earlier, is there a responsibility, do you think, for an Indian American candidate or an Asian American candidate to address the concerns of their specific community? Additionally, do those candidates bring something with them coming from a background that is not necessarily grounded in traditional Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian history and tradition? Do they bring something different to the American story, to the American experience?
Right. Well, all right. So let's begin with the comment you made towards the end, namely that so these are people who are not coming from a Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian tradition. Are they bringing something to American politics, more widely perhaps to American society? That second part, that is American society, that's a large set of issues, right? And yeah, I think that the answer that most people would give would be a predictable one here, that yes, they are part of the tapestry of what becomes America, right? That they are emblematic of the whole idea of multiculturalism, right? And so what makes America rich, according to this narrative, culturally rich, is the presence of immigrants from all over. But my view is that the story is, again, more complicated than seems to be the case, because in some ways the US, even though it has a culturally very diverse population, that is that they come from all over the world, in some ways America is the most homogeneous society in the world, because essentially no country has so effectively been able to integrate people into some dominant ideas, into the acceptance of some dominant ideas. So the LA Unified School District claims that the children in all of its schools speak 165 languages at home. All right. But let's pursue that narrative, because they'll stop there and they'll say that, and it's said with great evident pride, because it means that, yeah, we're a great multicultural society. What you don't hear is, let's track these children who speak 165 languages for just 10 years. Forget about an entire generation, just track them for 10 years. What you'll find is that the vast majority of them, no matter which linguistic background they came from, have lost that language. And their children will certainly have lost it entirely. Okay? And what they also don't tell you is that the 165 countries that are represented, the children from these 165 countries, within a year, they're all going to Walmart, all eating Burger King hamburgers and McDonald's. They've all been homogenized. I mean, this country is spectacularly successful in homogenizing its citizens, right? So the question here was, okay, so do these Indian Americans bring something, to the American political scene? And if you ask the candidates themselves, they'll tell you, yeah, well, of course we do. We bring the rich culture of India, But that's just assumed, because then you'd have to really ask, well, what is their conception of the rich culture of India? I mean, I find very often that the Indian Americans here whose conception of Indian culture is a completely colonial conception, because all they really are familiar with is the kind of understanding of Hinduism that has become a kind of a conventional standard understanding. For them, Hinduism means the Bhagavad Gita, and a few pujas at the temple in Artesia or wherever. But that's not popular Hinduism. I'm sorry. Popular Hinduism includes all kinds of things that they've never dreamt of in their whole life. And that's the bulk of what constitutes Hinduism, right? You're going into temples where chicken is being cooked, women going into trances, people following religions that have nothing to do, or religious practices that have nothing to do with the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and, the great classical conception of Hinduism, right? This is all part of Hinduism, popular Hinduism. But for them, Hinduism means basically a textbook view, a few rituals, right? And then they'll say what they also bring to politics is, the values of hard work and thrift that you find in all Indian American families, right? But you see, again, that's, in my view, not entirely acceptable, because if a Indian American candidate says, well, we bring the values of middle class families, hard work, thrift, belief in education, the assumption there is that other communities are not bringing that. We singularly are bringing that, right? So that becomes a problem, right? And on the whole, and my view here may well be the view of a minority, but I would certainly adhere to it, all the Indian American communities have not been, I would say, politically progressive in the United States, right? So the answer, I think, that I've given you, looks at a whole range of these factors and says that, well, yes, there is a conventional narrative according to which they do bring something. And what they bring is they add to the tapestry of America, to the color of America, so people will begin to know what Holi is and what Dasara is, and so on. And that the Hindu American Foundation, for example, that they have been working very actively to, for example, have Diwali recognized in the U.S. Congress, which it was. That doesn't mean it's a national holiday, of course, but there was a resolution passed in the U.S. Congress a year and a half ago, recognizing Diwali as the festival of the Hindu community, right? So, from their point of view, that's a great triumph. And I'm not saying that it may not be an achievement, but it's not as innocent as they think it is. That's what I'm saying, right? I think there's always a politics that one has to be aware of. Yeah.
In these regards, how different is the Indian community, Indian American community from other Asian American communities, Chinese, Japanese, Korean?
Well, that's sort of a large question, right? I mean, I think that there are some things that are common to all the communities, such as the fact that on the whole their political representation has been minimal. Whether the Japanese American community, the Chinese American communities have similarly what one might describe as frozen conceptions of their own culture, or conceptions of culture which cannot easily be reconciled with what you find back in Japan or China, that I'm not sure that I'm really prepared to say much about that, because I don't know enough about, let's say, the cultural practices in China to be able to say that, well, what is a real divergence, in the Chinese American community from what happens back there. And we know that China itself is undergoing such dramatic changes over the course of the last decade or two, in particular. But the Chinese American community also, that you have to keep in mind that, that there are older Chinese American communities, then they are much more affluent Chinese Americans who really come from Hong Kong. So, if you go to the Monterey Park region, these huge Chinese restaurants that you get, seating 400, 500 people with grand dim sums. But this is largely, I think, for people like the Hong Kong, Chinese. So it's going to be a very different community in some respects than some of the other Chinese communities. India itself has, for example, a Chinese community. This community has a history of 200 years. But you can't really look at them in comparison to the Han Chinese, right? They have their own history, and they got into particular vocations and professions in India. So one couldn't really assimilate it into just something called the Chinese community. There are different kinds of Chinese communities, and that brings me to the consideration, which I think is actually rather more important, that we speak of the Indian American community in the singular. But in fact, the Gujaratis and the Tamilians and the Malayalis and the Punjabis are quite different. So LA, for example, is, I would say, dominated by the Gujarati community. Here is very strong, and this has repercussions for how we think and what is the relation about the community and what its relationship is to India, because the Gujarati American community has been, I would say, politically as regressive as the Gujaratis back in India itself. Okay, Gujarat has become a state that is deeply troubled. It has a high rate of development, but it is also highly inhospitable to many people, such as the Muslims. Highly inhospitable, and I'm putting it mildly there, right? And I had a research project here for a couple of years. So I had a student of mine go and talk to people in the Gujarati American community, and the questions that were posed had to do with, for example, the pogrom, which is not a word to be taken lightly, and here is used very accurately. Some people would use stronger words, but the pogrom that took place against Muslims in 2002, which led to the killing of 2,000 Muslims in Gujarat, under the watch of Narendra Modi, then the chief minister and still the chief minister of Gujarat, right? With the tacit approval of the Gujarat government. I think that has been demonstrated without any shadow of a doubt, okay? And so I had this student of mine who's a Gujarati American go into the Gujarati American community here to do interviews. She interviewed 30 people, and she found that not one of them was willing to offer a critique of the killings that had taken place. Not one person in that community. I think that's absolutely shocking, right? So I think that before we even think about comparing the Indian Americans with Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and so on and so forth, that I think it would be useful to make distinctions within the Indian American community, not in order to create divisiveness, but in order to be able to better understand the community itself. I think there's a significant difference between Gujarati Americans, and Punjabi Americans, right, and people from the south of India, because these people are placed in different communities, they follow different professions, we know that for certain, for the most part, different levels of affluence, different levels of integration into the wider American society, right? So I think we would have to, and different forms of religious practice and worship. That's very important. So you go to a Baps Mandir, it's largely Gujarati constituency, extremely wealthy. If you ever go to the Baps temple in Bartlett, which is about 60 miles outside Chicago, built at the cost of $50 million US, right? With marble imported from Italy. hundreds of Indian craftsmen working on it. I mean, it's really grand and ostentatious and so on. Has no resemblance to, the roadside temples that you find in India, or the very small temples with which the Indian community grew up in the 70s over here, right? But the Baps temple is a temple that is frequented largely by the Gujaratis. Okay, so it's new Gujarati money, if I may put it this way, right? And the Baps temple also has certain political views. You see, that's the difficulty there. Then you have to start thinking about what kind of views, what is their conception of India, right? What kind of investments do they make in the United States? And I don't mean investments in the corporate world, but what is their commitment to education, for example? Right? What is their commitment to the concept of a wider concept of social good? That is, that will they engage in activities that will help to create linkages between Indian Americans and Hispanic Americans and African Americans? I don't think they would dream of doing that, right? So this is why I think we're going to have to really seriously look much more deeply into the sub-national groups within the Indian American community.
Last question from me, and I just thought of it as you were talking. Recently, Rod Blagojevich was brought down from his office as the governor of Illinois.
That's right.
And it had a lot to do actually with a small fundraiser that was thrown by some Indo-Americans on behalf of Jesse Jackson Jr.
Yes.
And it was a coalition of a Muslim Indian American, a Sikh Indian American, and I think a Gujarati Hindu. And they together banded, for Devon Street Merchants Association or something. And it reminded me a little bit, when I first learned of it, of the Hacienda Heights Buddhist temple, where Gore was raising money, and there was sort of a backlash. And for many years, Chinese stayed out of donating to political campaigns. That was a backlash. Do you foresee a similar kind of backlash from Indo-American civic involvement? I mean, or are we too integrated, or does it just depend on the scandal? Something big enough?
Yeah, no, I mean, at this point, I don't, I mean, I'm aware of the circumstances you've described. But at this point, I don't foresee that would have a backlash in the Indian American community. I don't think it's going to prevent Indian Americans from contributing, to further electoral campaigns, whether national election campaigns or those conducted at the state and district levels. And I think partly it has to do with the fact that the ascendancy of Obama to the presidency, of the U.S. A matter in which I think many Indian Americans felt that they had a stake as well. So I think that is more than enough at this point to offset whatever damage may have been caused by the circumstances that you're describing. But it's also very clear that one of the things that the Obama campaign was able to show was that you could rely not simply on large donors, but as has been talked